Hey, how's it going? Corey Partridge here. Just gonna go over a brief um, description and kind of small little discussion about my analysis paper that I wrote on personal bias affecting emergency medical services. Um, First off, I like to say defined defined bias. Um, Bias is defined as one's particular tendency, trend, inclination, feeling, opinion that is preconceived or unreasoned. It can also be described as feelings or opinions about certain social groups or cultural groups. I cited that from um, Merriam-Webster's Dictionary.com. Um, Through one's particular tendency, trend, inclination, feeling, opinion being preconceived or unreasoned, I will give some examples of how EMTs and paramedics personal bias has negative effects and feedbacks uh, from patients and affecting the opinions of EMS agencies and pre-hospital care providers. Um, also kind of talk about the unreasonable bias feelings or opinions about certain patient groups and social groups. Uh, let's see here. Uh, I don't have time to go over the whole thing, so I'm trying to break it down because I already tried going over the whole paper and it ended up being 20 minutes. So I saw that it should be 10 minutes or less to get the 80 points. So I just want to talk about um, when it comes to pre-hospital care, EMTs or paramedics can often get in the tendency or trend of treating all their patients having the same chief complaint. That means these paramedics or EMTs consistently run patients with the chief complaints, and by their personal bias, trend these patients and provide care for the complaint and not always the needs of that patient with that chief complaint. Meaning, what I'm trying to say is, with personal bias, that is not necessarily a good idea or mindset to get into as pre-hospital care provider, as a patient with the same chief complaint can always present differently with different severities and different treatment needs. The paramedics trend care for the patients with the same complaint can lead to the error of overlooking crucial clues and signs of life-threatening problems, which determine a measure of treatment that could be life-saving. So by their personal bias, they are trending patient care to multiple patients with the chief complaint and can potentially be overlooking life-threatening problems or severities based off not treating each patient differently to their needs and what's best for the patient. Here's an example. Per personal experience, working on the ambulance and fire department, a common trend care or personal bias I see is when responding to a patient that has drugs or alcohol on board, or patient acting intoxicated in public. Initially, the crew suspects the patient to be intoxicated, a trend patient presentation of someone looking rough, drug seeking, addict, or may have had too much to drink and now passed out or vomiting at a location where they are not wanted. When arriving on scene, the crew seems to first ask would alert and orientated questions with what have you taken or how much have you had to drink today instead of what's going on, what have you called us for today. So there's a there is a trend of questioning and a trend of initial assessment. The crew usually then gets a personal bias mindset of typical trend of care of these patients, overlooking things that could present to a more serious or life-threatening medical emergency occurring. Treating patient care to patient based off a chief complaint is an insufficient way to provide the from E is an insufficient way to provide care from EMTs or paramedics due to the negative impact or outcome it can have on a patient's life. Um, also, the next is personal bias, EMS. Um, Unreasonable feelings or opinions of social groups, patient groups, or cultural groups affect the outcome of the patient care provided. A big thing I used with that was defining the word justice, the obligation to treat all patients fairly, justified. I pulled that from Paramedic Care Principles and Practice, Volume 1, 5th edition, page 631. By saying that, the definition means whether the patient is a criminal, homeless person, currently being a public nuisance, rich, poor, black, white, Middle Eastern, blue, green. As an EMT or paramedic, pre-hospital care providers have the duty to treat that patient with the highest level of care, doing what is best for the patient. Also treating that patient as what's best for that patient and not what the paramedic thinks best for, and also treat that patient how that paramedic wants to be treated. Um, EMS providers who think they know what is best for the patient and not necessarily treating the patient based off what is best for the patient or treating the patient how they would want to be. The final factor is the misuse of 911, which can cause a lot of personal bias, or first responders by people who do not necessarily need an ambulance crew to treat them or transport them to the hospital. All these factors play in emergency bias or personal bias in the pre-hospital care. Factors of the bias in EMS can be described from the breakdown of heuristics, cognitive dispositions to respond, anchoring, confirmation bias, diagnosis, momentum, attribution error, overconfidence bias, and search satisfying. Heuristics are defined as psychology as heuristics are defined is psychology as simple, efficient rules that explains how people make decisions, come to judgments, and solve problems. That was pulled off a Jim's article I found on the internet over escaping faulty thinking and how to minimize bias. In pre-hospital care, heuristics can cause serious errors by causing EMS providers to miss what is right in front of them. EMS providers make errors when assessing patients with the understanding that they will fall into certain categories and the patient's presentations will be typical for the patients in those categories. The problem with heuristics is that they can predispose pre-hospital care providers to respond to certain situations in certain ways. These predispositions are called cognitive dispositions to respond. Anchoring is a tendency for EMTs or paramedics to lock onto the patient's initial presentation too early in the diagnostic process and fail to adjust the initial impression in light of information acquired later on in the call. An example of this is tunnel vision phenomenon, when an EMS provider sees one patient in a motor vehicle collision but not others who may be more critically injured. Anchoring may be compounded by what is called confirmation bias, a type of bias in which pre-hospital care providers tend to look over evidence that confirms the assessment they have already made, and fail to consider persuasive evidence and changes that assessment. Following is diagnosis momentum, the process of attaching a label to that patient, which sticks from the scene to transporting patient into emergency room. This causes an emergency room physician to trust the label the EMS provider has given, basing their assessment off that label rather than performing a complete history and physical examination of their own. Our attribution error can result by the first responder of EMS provider being judgmental or blaming patients for their illnesses rather than fully examining the circumstances that brought the EMS call. EMTs and paramedics are particularly vulnerable to attribution error when dealing with psychiatric patients, homeless patients, and minority patients. Following is overconfidence bias. Like I said earlier, is a tendency to believe we know more than we actually do and think we know what is best for the patient instead of trying to decide what is truly best for the patient. These EMS providers may act in one complete information blasphemy and intuition when EMTs or paramedics blessing fail to gather evidence in a careful and systematic manner. Errors can result finally. Search satisfying bless me in the tendency to call off a search once something is found. Life-threatening conditions and additional medical problems may be missed when EMTs or paramedics call off the search too early. To conclude, I just want to say that strategies that EMS agencies and pre-hospital care providers can introduce in the EMS community to combat personal bias or conduct scenario-based training and simulations, focus less on using algorithmic protocols and more on developing critical thinking and reasoning skills, considering alternatives to initial assessment, constantly asking what else might be going on with the patient, and finally accepting personal bias, taking steps to change them, and using careful, thoughtful patient assessments, frequent reassessments, and open-mindedness. I also gave a few examples of personal bias that led to critical error in pre-hospital care providing. Thank you and have a great day.